put away the books and just go out and walk. But as a way of introduction to maybe somewhat loosely an introduction to Ecclesiastes, it's hard to overlook what is happening in our world. Even if you're trying to overlook what's happening in our world, it's impossible to overlook what's happening in our world. And I think it's fair to say that for most of us, maybe all of us, we have not had the kind of interaction with the Vatican in our lifetime. And I say that in all seriousness because I've heard, and you have, that, X or Y should stay out of politics. And by the way, we can say that. But if you read the biblical text, you're going to have a very difficult time as a person of faith to do that, because the text is replete with political statements, some of which we may not want, not us in this room, because we are enlightened, but others may not want to believe it deals with policy, but some of which does, and some of which deals with war, and some of which deals with peace, and some of which deals with conflict, and there is violence, and all of the above. And I was struck again, because even though this is not anything new, maybe to most, if not all of us, I was struck again that these are two very common Greek words that you may recognize if you've been spending it. Instead, rather than looking for Captain America, if you've been spending your time reading Greek, you would recognize these words. And the first is polis, which of course all of us in this room know. And so, in case you're wondering, how do we know this? We know this because we have names like, in our neighborhood, Annapolis, or Indianapolis, or Minneapolis, a whole series of polis words. And why? The word means city. Okay? The word means city. That's all it means. The city of Anna or the city of Lakes, right? As in Minneapolis. And it's important because on the basis of that word, we have the other word, polites, which means citizen. Okay? And if you look at the word, it's the word that gives us the word politics. Okay, you see where we're going with this? Okay, so this is not, me, Hemchan, making up this stuff. By the way, I can, but I don't have to. Okay? Polites simply means politics. That's all it is. Or it could mean even, it means politics. And of course, the word means citizen. And so you can see this is not sort of a major stretch to move from that which is politics to that which is citizen. The connection is almost immediate and straightforward. And then there is a word that comes even further that is pronounced politea. And interestingly, it has to do with citizenship and sometimes, you ready? Translated constitution. And it's all based on the same root. And we're saying these things because sometimes, I don't mean us in this class, this group, and I'm saying this with all seriousness, sometimes we hear these things thrown around that you should not be talking, and we have this, right? At the dinner table, there are certain things you should not be discussing, such as politics and religion. Which means that when you're at a dinner table, what happens? There's nothing to talk about. Okay?
Or
Sports, which, by the way, if you think politics and religion are divisive, and so, when we think about this, all I'm saying, let's have an invitation to think about, as people of faith, that we really sort of hold and take seriously the sacred text, that we, in fact, not immediately say, oh yeah, you know what, I'm going to let the politicians talk about politics. I think that's, to me, that's a relinquishing of our responsibility as people of faith. We have to be engaged. And it would be easy if everyone agreed with everything. But last time I checked, e pluribus unum means, let me go ahead and tell you because you're sounding like my students now, formerly. E pluribus unum, of course, means out of many, one, right? It's a statement of unity, but it has never been a statement of uniformity. It has never been a statement that we all have to agree with everything. That would be, actually, I think that would be terrible, frankly, and boring, right? And boredom, as you know, I believe is a sin, but no one has asked me about that. I almost don't want to hear any of my children or grandchildren or friends saying I'm bored. Bored in this world? So we want to take seriously, and we want to sort of ensure that when these things are thrown out there, right, that in fact we also take the time to say, well, I want to be more discerning about this. I want to be able to get back into the text. I want to struggle with interpretations, and it is difficult, to be sure. And we see this, but we also see religious leaders making statements. And I'll speak for myself, it bothers me to no end that there are some among us who are willing to simply strip away and sacrifice core beliefs for the sake of a kind of allegiance that has no basis in sort of reality. So, for what it's worth, we'll keep politics, if not in the forefront of our consciousness, we still have to deal with it. It's part of life. The second thing is this. So why we cannot speak, or we should not speak about politics at the dinner table, then also religion. And as you know, the word religion comes from a Latin root, bear with me here, okay? That means, now, I know we know Latin in this group, okay? But I am also aware that we may not realize that we know Latin in this group. And the reason is we know these words. We may not immediately connect them, but we know these words. And religion comes from the same root that every single person in this room here, in their body, has this word as part of our physical body. It's the same root that gives us the word ligament. Religio. It's connected with the word ligament. It has to do with that which binds. And so we have to decide, what is it that we will bind ourselves to? By the way, if it's power, that's going to be a religion. I don't know how else to put it. If that's principle. If it's going to be wealth, and that's principle. But if it's going to be kind of a covenantal relationship, then we have to take that seriously as something that binds us with all that it brings. Two other quick things here before we get into Ecclesiastes. Pastor Roy this morning mentioned, and this is a well-known text as you already know, the journey to Emmaus. And as you also know, that I don't delve too much into the New Testament before, I lose my way, so to speak. But I know enough, which, as Alexander Pope the poet once said, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, right? And we are surrounded by little knowledge all over this country. Okay, as an aside. But it's the breaking of bread, right? But the word to walk in Hebrew is the word that is used to describe the collection of Hebrew laws, the halakha. It's the same word, it means to walk. And so every time I hear this, I'm struck by the fact that part of the idea of subscribing to the things that unite us, that hold us together, by which we will live, is also means to walk. In other words, you cannot simply just talk about certain things. You have to live it. And this story reminds me again about this, that until the breaking of bread happens, right, you may not recognize the stranger. In other words, at that point, it's all theoretical. Yes, you're walking along, you're even chatting, but there is something practical that has to be born out of that moment at which revelation happens. It has to be. And the breaking of bread, in my estimation, is one of the most profound sort of and personal and intimate engagements that we could have with a stranger. It's easy when we're with each other because we're friends, we're family, we sit at the table. Literally, we break bread, but of course, bread is what? You remember? As in, give us this day our daily bread. It's a figure of speech. It's what is called a litotes. It's an understatement for effect. It's a figure of speech that give us this day everything that will sustain us. And so it's easy to say, I'm going to walk with this person, but I have no idea who you are. And somewhere along the line, we'll part ways because, of course, to kill the David Thoreau quote, okay, we will take different paths. But before we do that, break bread. And it is in that moment we realize that the stranger is no longer the stranger. And that's what happens in this story. It's in that moment. And by the way, it doesn't mean that physically you have to go and say, okay, I'm going to break bread. I mean, we're too smart for that. But it's the moment where something dramatic happens by way of a covenant that allows you not to be a stranger anymore, or not to distance yourself from a stranger. It's a very practical thing. And it's difficult, as we heard this morning, because strangers are, difficult. All right. So, vanity of vanities. We know this opening line, right? We've heard it many times. It's as well known as practically anything. Isn't there a song about this? Huh? Something about, yeah, Peter. I think Google it. Not now. You were tempted there, weren't you? No. Temptation is not a bad thing. What's the problem? Yielding. That's the problem. So here's the thing. Google Peter Seeger. You'll see.
You're thinking of turn, but they don't use the term vanity.
No, it's turn, right? Season, right? And just as well that they don't use the word vanity. Now, the word vanity is used in the King James Version. It's used in the New Revised Standard Version. And I am often very careful with these translations, but on this occasion, I'm going to be straightforward about it. That's a terrible translation. Okay? Vanity of vanities. When you hear the word vanity, what comes to mind? No, seriously, what comes to mind? Of course, it's a derivative of the word what? Vain, right? And if you're vain, you're what? You're propelled by? Yeah, ego, right? And this word has nothing to do with that. I mean, as in, yeah, you might think, maybe if we kind of, squint our eyes, we could see where it shows up as vanity. No. It doesn't mean that. And for some reason, that word has just kind of, it keeps coming down, and you would think with newer translations that it would move away from that word. So what are we talking about? This is the word that is used, by the way, in Hebrew. Havel. Havel. That's the word that is used in Hebrew. And the word actually, in the King James Version, translates it vanity. The New Revised Standard Version, which I think is maybe as contemporary English translations go, is as good as we can get. It's not perfect. That animal doesn't exist, but it's as good as we can get. And it keeps the word vanity. Now, the New International Version takes a little bit of a different path and uses the word meaningless. Okay? And by the way, in case you're wondering if translations will lead you to think about text in particular ways, immediately that takes you into a different path, doesn't it? Okay, you're not thinking about ego, you're not thinking about someone who is vain or any such thing. And this word is used 38 times in the book of Ecclesiastes, more than any other place in all of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, 38 times. And here's what I think the word should be. And I say this because in case anyone calls me up and checks that and says, Hemchan, we're translating the Bible and we think that maybe we should check with you about Havel. By the way, don't hold off on your meals waiting for that to happen, right? But if someone did, it would be something like fleeting or transient. That's really what the word means. And what is striking about this is that it's repeated here. Havel, Havelim. And in Hebrew, every time, 99.9% of the time, you see a word that ends in Hebrew with I am, it's a masculine plural ending, right? So we don't add S to it. I know people do. Like when you hear the word seraphim, I am, they talk about what? Seraphims, right? There is no seraphims, okay? Seraphim is already plural. Or cherubim, that's already plural, right? Same here, Havelim. Why is this important? There is a vanity of vanities. What they're saying is, in Hebrew, the title of the book is not Ecclesiastes, that's a Greek title. It's Koheleth. And we believe that the one who is writing this is actually a teacher in Jerusalem. And the teacher is saying, this is the picture. The teacher is saying, as I look out into the world, everything is transient. Everything is fleeting. And not so much that it's not meaningless. Did I say meaningless?
No, you said
Meaningless, okay. You will correct me if I say meaningless. I'm sure you will. Okay. But everything is fleeting, right? Nothing is permanent. And, you can see a little bit of what other religious thought in here. A little bit of Buddhist idea in here, the impermanence of life, which is to say what? Don't hold on too tightly. Things will come to an end. And what he's saying here is that, listen, life is fleeting. And the reason it's repeated here, it's almost, I'll give you the parallel here, which is one that you know, right? In ancient Israel, and I suppose in some respects, centuries ago, we used to have a phrase, we rarely use it anymore, even though we're familiar with it, that you would go into the sanctuary, right? And the word sanctuary means what? It's the Latin word sanctus. We used to sing, right? Sanctus. That means holy. And then as you get up to the altar area, you're entering what? The Holy of Holies, right? Where there was a time when you and I were not really allowed to enter into the Holy of Holies. You remember those, the traditional, there were rails there? Right, right. Vanity of Vanities is sort of like that, which is to say, there is a pronouncement of how really transient, really fleeting life really is. It's not permanent. And the thing about it is that you and I know that, right? It's not as if somehow I'm going to say, raise your hands of anyone who think that we're going to live forever. I mean, silly question, right? We know that there, in fact, the text talks about that, even about death being the great what? The great equalizer. The great equalizer, right? Nobody dies and then, let me write a check for $1 billion, It's the great equalizer. It might be a fancier occasion, but death is death. So, what we're talking about here is that, in a way, the Revised English Bible even calls it, I don't like this translation myself, but again, they didn't ask me. They refer to it as the futility of life. But I like the idea of transience. There is, yes, it's here, but it's not permanent. It's not permanent. It will not go on forever. And that's why Vanity of Vanities has, I would suggest, even has a kind of a negative, even pessimistic overtone. I don't care. I mean, Vanity of Vanities, there's, whatever, we have egomaniacs. By the way, all of that may be true. That's just not what the text says. The text is talking about how fleeting this life is. Sometimes one might say how unpredictable this life is. And by the way, I suspect all of us in this room have experience in some ways of the suddenness of pain that comes into life, death that occurs when, that is shocking, etc. And that underlines the fleetingness of life. And this is what he is talking about. So, and for us in this society, maybe as much as any other society in the world, and I'm not extricating myself from this, I'm very much a part of this. We are a driven people, right? We work, yes, we rest, and we believe in rest, but the fact that we believe in rest doesn't mean that we rest. There's always a good reason. And we believe in having a peaceful existence, but
not too much.
But I know. We believe in a peaceful existence, but we don't want to get carried away with all that peace stuff, right? Yeah.
$1.5 trillion for war.
$1.5 trillion for war. And we believe in peace, but we believe in peace with an asterisk. Okay? And then for those of us who work with text, and this I'm just confessing here, I love footnotes. And I know that's a rarity among many people. They just want to read the text and get on with it. And I want to read the text and see what those little footnotes at the bottom say. And often they tell us a great deal, right? So we love peace, but getting the whole peace gets in the way of other things, doesn't it? I mean, we love rest. By the way, why should we love rest?
God rested. God rested, each day.
God rested each day. How's that working out for us?
Not real good.
We're on Sunday, aren't we?
We're on Sunday. And
the
we
day of
don't
rest.
and it's the day of rest. And so what do we do on the day of rest?
Watch baseball.
And by the way, if that doesn't stress you out, I don't know what will, right?
But it's a different kind of stress.
Oh, we have different kinds of stress. That's a good stress?
I didn't say that.
But, so we have a bad stress. Here's the thing. We find ways. I'm speaking of, right, whether it's a day of rest, but even as you go back to Genesis, right, what happens after day one? It was evening, it was morning, the first day, and it was good. And then we begin the second day, and evening and morning. And by the way, not only rest, but what? If you determine that something is good or bad, it means that you are doing what? You're reflecting on this. So it's both rest and reflection that we have. A time of pause, particularly in lives such as ours, where pausing seems to be far too much of that's a luxury for us. And here is an invitation that says, life is transient, it's fleeting, pause. Not because I'm suggesting you pause, but if we take seriously the text, pause, reflect. How has the day been? By the way, and not like you say that and then you just keep going. How has the day been? And you are actually reflecting on this. So, vanity of vanities, the transient of life. In a way, if ever we are looking I'm breaking up the stuff that belongs to Good Shepherd. In case you don't see me here next week, you know what happens, right? So, and I was thinking about this text because, of course, following up on this opening verse, and I will read this in a second, we have a word that is pronounced, it's pronounced amal. That means toil or labor. And so the text is actually spoken in the context of people who are toiling and laboring all the time. And so in case you're wondering if this text has implications for contemporary society, it does. For us, this is who we are. And I'm not saying this is a bad thing, right? I'm not. For those of us who see what we do as a vocation, it's not. And yet, even as we do those things, it's a call for us to rest. So for everything, there's a season and a time for every matter under heaven. And so we begin. And I want to read this because, not only because I believe it is beautiful and magnificent in the sounding of it, but it has implications for us. And I will stand back here, and we'll read it. You have it in the print, but it's something that, we read with our young children and maybe with our grandchildren. We've had, haven't we, a habit over the years to read aloud to them, and then there comes a point where we stop because adults never read to each other. That's just too much for the children, which is a shame, because we can not only use our eyes, we also want to use our voice to hear these words. So there's a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal. And by the way, you can see the parallels here, some of which is really striking, because if you're like me, you probably want to redact. You know that word? You've heard this word, right? We haven't used it in our society or anything like that recently. Epstein. Redact. We want to redact kill, but we can't. It's part of the text. Sadly, it's part of what we've inherited, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up. a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw away stones and a time to gather. And by the way, you read this and we're thinking, where is this coming from? And yet think about this as a teacher who is looking out into the world and saying, these are the things, these are the sort of, if you will, the opposites that hold us. These are the tensions in our lives. And we need tension in our lives. I know that sounds almost counterintuitive, where someone says, I don't need that kind of tension in my life. Actually, we need some tension in our lives. We want tension on the door so that when we open it, it doesn't slam slowly and it closes. So we need a little bit of that. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to seek and a time to lose. A time to keep and a time to throw away. By the way, I don't know if that has anything to do with hoarding, but that, a time to tear and a time to sow. Put back together that which is torn. Put back together that which is broken. And this is a serious, serious admonition to us. Because, again, this is not any kind of partisan, any of that. The fact of the matter, we are in the midst of something that is just remarkably fractured and fragmented and difficult. And it has to be sewn back together. And what is striking about this, it does not say discard this and then get something new. It says put it back together. Put it back together. Sew it back together. And the only way that works is that it presupposes that something is what? Broken or torn apart. It presupposes that. Or sewing becomes, well, nothing. A time to keep silent and a time to speak. And I'm often struck by this because I think there are many, many moments where we simply have to speak. And to keep silent, we have that old saying, silence is golden, right? It's a virtue.
Not all the time.
But not all the time. There are moments where you must speak, and if you don't, right, and you look back later on and saying, well, I should have, that's gone. There are moments when you have to. And I'll give you two quick examples. One of which I think maybe it's been over a couple of years ago I shared with you. Elie Wiesel in 1986, I think it was, received the Congressional Medal of Honor from President Reagan, as you know, who was the president at the time. And it's a huge deal, of course, right? We sometimes, I have to say, mess that up in recent times by diminishing its importance, but it's a huge thing. And then he gave a speech. And in the context of that speech, does anyone remember what the president at the time was about to embark on? I know, it's difficult, I get it. But the president was about to embark on a journey to Europe, including Germany. Okay? No, that's before. That's before, yeah, that's before. Okay? Because this is back in the mid-'80s. Okay. And part of that journey was controversial. And the controversy had to do with his impending visit to a cemetery, right? That was called Bitburg Cemetery. And it was known to have had a number of SS buried there. And many people had spoken about it, and essentially, behind the scene, were starting to say, you know, this, they were talking about optics. This does not look good, kind of thing. And Elie Wiesel, in receiving that, said, Mr. President, I know we have met several times, and I know how strongly you feel about the care for all of humanity and your own moral compass. And he meant it. He said, but I plead with you, do not go to Bitburg Cemetery. Please, Mr. President, don't go to Bitburg Cemetery. That place is not our place. Don't give any kind of credence to that place. Don't go, Mr. President. What happened?
He went anyway.
Yeah, the president went anyway. So here's my point, okay? The fact that the president went is a decision for a variety of reasons why the president went. But it was important that in a public, Elie Wiesel could have spoken to him privately, you know, behind closed doors. But some things have to be spoken because it's important. But you speak it not because you know how it's all going to eventuate. We speak it not because we know that in so speaking, I have spoken and therefore the landscape must change. No, we speak it because it must be spoken and that it's true. Truth to power, we know that phrase. You must. Because there will be a time when you will look back and say, I wish that I had spoken up. And then it is really too late. We know this. But then there are other times when, unless there is redemptive value in it, it's okay to be silent. And I think I shared with you, and if you have not read this book, it's worth reading, a book that is written by Simon Wiesenthal, a name that you know, and it's called The Sunflower. And it's profound because it paints the story of an event that happened at Auschwitz, in a concentration camp. And there's a young man in the infirmary there. His name is Karl. He's 21 years of age. Okay. He is a member of the Nazi. He's a Nazi's SS at a young age. And by every indication in the description, in the narrative of the book, he was, even at that age, he was a very, very brutal and violent person. And his most sort of devastating and egregious and painful act was to participate and being the architect of sealing a house with 200 Jews and setting it on fire. And celebrated. Karl. But then Karl was injured, seriously injured, to the point where it was apparent that he was going to die. And Karl says to one of the, quote, commandants who is looking over the infirmary, that he would like to speak with, I'm telling you what it says, it sounds harsh, I would like to speak with a Jew, any Jew. And the commandant brings Simon. And what Karl wants, anyone, you want to guess what Karl wants?
Absolution.
He wants absolution for his actions. He wants to be absolved, if you will, of, quote, the sin that he has committed. But by the way, who listens to absolution? typically? The priest or pastor, right? But for Carl, that didn't matter. And he begins to outline all the things that he had done, and Simon simply listens. Because it became an ethical question that was sent around the world. Does one person have the right to grant forgiveness for a whole nation or a whole people? And Simon listens, but never says anything. And Carl essentially is almost asking him for forgiveness. But he doesn't say anything, because what is there to say? Can I grant forgiveness for a whole people? And you really can't. But at the end, before Carl dies, Carl said, I have one request to make for you. I do not have too many belongings, but if you emerge out of this, would you take my few belongings to my mother and give it to her? And Simon says, yes, I will do that if I, survive this. And he does. And he takes it to Carl's mother. And he says, this is from Carl. And Carl's mother says, oh, my son Carl, what a good boy he was. Carl was such a good son. What a good boy my Carl was. Okay. Should Simon tell the mother about her Carl or not? What do you think he did? If you're tracking with me, he didn't. He didn't. Initially, he thought, as you can imagine, the human impulse is to do what? Oh, I will tell you what your son Carl was like, right? But in listening, he realized, no. First of all, it would destroy the mother, but is there any possibility of redemption by... And Simon remained silent. By the way, this story, just for the record, was sent out to literally hundreds of scholars and ethicists and priests and ministers around the world to get responses as to what they think Simon should do. And it was all over the place. From, tell him, tell her, destroy, the range was human vengeance, to no, and so many in between. There is a place to keep silent and a place to speak. And I would say for many of us today, a place to speak might be our moment. But it might be like Rizal, and we may not see a transformation that happens overnight. But that's not the issue, whether or not, in speaking, if you don't see change, then it isn't worth it. It isn't worth it. And then there's a time to love and a time to hate. And we would just as soon redact hate out of this, but we don't have that luxury either. We're not supposed to hate. And as the old saying goes, hating is kind of like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. Okay? That is to say, it destroys us from within, and we may feel better in that moment, but then, of course, it doesn't last. But anger has some redemptive value. In the face of injustice, in the face of things that destroy, that fragment, that rip us apart, we should be You show me one single Hebrew prophet who came along and is just singing, Kumbaya to. No. They came and they are angry at what's happening. And they speak out. And it doesn't always change, which is why we're still speaking about it today. It doesn't always change. A time for war, and this is how it ends. A time for war and a time for peace. And in case you're wondering if any of this could apply to us, right? We could take the last line and simply plaster it wherever we work or live and wonder, what do we do now? A time for war and a time for peace. But it can't simply be a pronouncement that has no kind of practicality to it. We can't just say, and let me sort of step out of this for a moment. It is not enough, and it drives me crazy. By the way, that could happen. It drives me crazy to hear some of our leaders say, well, we have to pursue peace. And I'm thinking, tell me something that I don't know. I know that. You know that. You know that. You know that. Even the folks who are involved with war know that. But then, what's the next step here? It can't simply be, I'm going to pronounce something that we already know. Some occasionally, okay, it's a good reminder, but that can't be the last word. Now, I want to say a word about this in a second. The book of Ecclesiastes, which is one of the reasons I choose it, not only because, let me go back to this, not only because it ends, this particular chapter ends on the note of a time for peace, but because I think it has implications for us. A recognition that the life that we live is a transient life. We may not all have either the freedom or even the time, frankly, to be able later on in time to speak. This is our time. We all have a moment. This might be, for many of us, our moment. How do we hold together our community, our families? Our nation, our world, our relationships that are fractured? I'll give you an example. On Friday, a couple of days ago, we had a gathering at my institution where I was about to give an opening speech. And it's a meaningful event. It happens once a semester. And it's a recognition of individuals who are in the military or who have served. And it's called Quilts of Valor. I don't know if you're familiar with this. It's actually an international movement, but it's very, very much part of the United States. It's called Quilts of Valor. And for folks who have served, are given a quilt. You can't buy this, you can't sell it, and these are magnificent quilts, handmade. And each is presented, and their service it's very meaningful, and I was privileged to give an opening welcome and speech for the institution. And as I look at these persons in a range of areas, from the Air Force and the Army, Marines, Navy. They're all there every semester. And their service. And the kind of courage and the kind of commitment. And I take it seriously. One of the recipients on Friday is a friend of mine. And I have known him for a number of years. And as they say, I believe he's just one of the good guys. He's in the Air Force. He's now an administrator, and a fine administrator, I should say, and a better friend. And has served in a variety of contexts. Also was one of the Secret Service folks for 3 different presidents, some of which he can't talk about. But that never prevented me from asking, as you can imagine. So we were speaking about this. He is deeply immersed and committed as a Christian, and deeply immersed and committed as a Catholic. Very, focused. And we were chatting, and I said to him, I'm not going to tell you his name, I said to him, have you ever experienced this deal with the Pope? What's going on here? And the president? And he said, in his household, both he and his wife are Catholics, and they see it very differently. I'm not going to tell you who is where, but they see it very differently. They are markedly different in their perspective of what is happening. I give you this example. I've not met his wife. I give you this example because when we talk about fracture and fragmentation, we see it in the news, of course. But in speaking with my friend, I realize it's also happening in some respects within people who are deeply committed, faithful folks, in this case, a husband and a wife, who are clearly divided in their perspective. One who believes that the Pope was wrong to say what the Pope did, and the other who believed that the Pope was exactly doing what popes should be doing. Very different. Healing, it says, is important as a precursor to peace. It does not come simply as a matter of course. And I'll finish up with this, because this is where we begin next week, just as an introduction. Okay? The Lord said to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul? I have rejected him from being king over Israel. And you might wonder, what in the world is going on here? And I bring this up because sometimes in the midst of transitions, in the midst of change, in the midst of brokenness, our hearts are broken, we grieve, we mourn for what is happening. In this case, in our society, in our world, in our families, in places of worship. Our son and his family were visiting us about 3 weeks ago during spring break, and they took a road trip and they were looking at schools and so on. They live in Minneapolis, and he works about a block and a half from where Alex Priddy was killed. And now all is well there, right? And he said, actually, no. He said the trauma and the psychological effect will simply go on for a while. He said in the neighborhood there are still schools that are closed for fear. You don't hear about it anymore, but the trauma will linger for a while. And there's going to be a time for mourning, and a time for grieving, and a time for healing. But there will also be a time when we have to look for a new path that we can sew together to bring together the brokenness in our society. Saul was kicked out. He's gone. Samuel is wondering about what's going to happen with our society. And the Lord says to Samuel, okay, you've had your time to mourn and to grieve. We have to find a new way. And as you know, that new way will become through David. All right. We'll stop there. We'll pick it up next week as we start with this text. But then we will look at a variety of texts, some of which we may be familiar with, but we will start looking at several texts from the book of Deuteronomy on peace and well-being. Thanks, everyone. See you next Sunday.
The word in the book of Koheles